Death at Bishop's Keep. Chapter 47. The cook was a good cook as cooks go, and as cooks go, she went. H. Munro, Reginald. Spending the night in the cramped, unheated stone jail behind the constable's office was not an experience Sarah Pratt would treasure in her memory. What she would remember, however, to the very end of her days, was riding to jail in the carriage. Pocket, to his everlasting credit, had donned his finest livery for the occasion. Cracking his whip with a fine flourish, he drove like the very blazes down High Street, the constable bringing up the rear on his bicycle, pedalling as fast as his feet could go. The carriage rattled at an amazing rate past the apothecary's on the corner, where Sarah's friends Gert and Gilda stopped their gossiping and stared, mouth open, as she drove by. It careened past St. Mary's on the right, where Rachel Elam was on her way to Ralph Elam's grave, with an armful of purple asters which she dropped in a heap on the path when Sarah waved at her, and past the Marlborough Head, where Crazy Mick, sweeping the steps, banged his broom handle into his nose when he gave her a politely condescending bow. By the time Sarah arrived at the jail and was handed out of the carriage with great show of dignity by Pocket, she was feeling only slight resentment at having her day's work interrupted for a visit with the constable. Granted, she was still a cook, had always been a cook, and would always be a cook, no matter how many carriages she rode. But the young Miss Ardley, God bless her bones, had treated her like a lady, and that gave Sarah something to think about as she prepared herself for a visit with the constable. As it turned out, however, that visit did not take place until morning. The constable seemed to hold the theory that a night spent in an iron cot in a cold cell might loosen her tongue, or perhaps he had something else more pressing to do. At any rate, he locked her up and sent Lily round from the pub with a bucket of hot stew, half loaf of bread, and a pint of ale. After that, the cot did not seem so hard, especially considering that she was not the one who had to cook the stew or wash the dish from which she ate. And as Sarah went to her knees beside the cot, she sat in prayer for the soul of the elder Miss Ardley and another for the younger, pausing to reflect before completing her address to the deity. Was it because she was American that Miss Ardley had so little respect for the established distinctions of rank? Were all Americans similarly blind to tradition and social custom? Was that how it was possible that Rachel Elam's brother Stanton, having sold both his cows and gone to America, now owned his own dairy, and his wife, who made indifferent cheeses with noticeable tendency to sourness, now was able to command 3 subordinate cheesemakers? Hearing no conclusive opinion on the matter from above, Sarah Pratt finished her prayers and climbed into a cot and went to sleep. But her sound sleep was sadly disturbed by pangs of conscience, for she deeply regretted Miss Ardley's death and the manner of her dying. While the mistress had an unfortunate share in Jenny's death, she had been tolerant and gentle. If she had not eaten the pudding, no doubt she would have been true to her word, restore both fire and sofa to the servants' hall, and jam as well. Jaggers, however, was another matter. Sarah could not feel even the slightest tinge of remorse when she thought of the woman's death. Indeed, she could not help but rejoicing. Yes, rejoicing. In every fibre of her being she felt her own part in the tragedy, deeply as well as she should. She was contrite and remorseful, although she had to admit of a deep satisfaction with the thought of her kitchen with no Jaggers in it. And even though she was not surprised that suspicion had first fallen on her, she knew it could hardly rest there long, for she had not been the one to select and chop the mushrooms, nor could it fall on little Harriet, for such a young innocent girl would not likely be called to account for the death, and Amelia, Nettie, and Maud had nothing to do with the preparation of the pudding. No, they were all safe from accusation. If anyone were called to account, it would be the one who had introduced the fatal toadstool into the kitchen. And in her heart of hearts, Sarah could not but hope that that person was more to be pitied than blamed, would also escape accusation. She would do her best to see that he was exonerated as well, and that the poisoning was viewed as the tragedy that it truly was. So Sarah Pratt's sleep was laced with dreams in which were mingled with regret, rejoicing, and relief, with the latter 2 sentiments prevailing. When the sun rose, she rose as well, almost as cheerily. She washed her face in the chip basin, straightened her garments, and smoothed her cot, on which she had patiently sat until Lily brought in from the pub a dish of fatty bacon, with biscuits and a pint of gravy. Having eaten well, Sarah found herself refreshed, alert, and only a little creaky to the joints. She was ready to answer whatever questions Constable Lagan saw fit to ask her. She knew exactly what she was going to say and how, exactly, she would explain the death of the 2 sisters. There was one slightly sticky part, but on the whole Sarah did not expect any surprises. The questioning began at 8, and it was carried out in the constable's office, a room which was only a little bigger than Sarah's pantry, crowded with a table, 2 wooden chairs, a shelf, an iron stove, with a photograph of the Queen, God give her a long and healthy life, hanging beside the window. The constable took one chair, Sarah settled herself in the other, smiled at the Queen, and prepared to answer the Queen's representative. The constable opened his notebook. "It would seem," he said, "that the victims died from eating a deadly mushroom." Sarah refused to feign sadness for Jaggers, but she could certainly feel a dart of it for the dead Miss Artley. It was that sadness she allowed to creep into her voice. "I knew as much." The constable's face tightened ever so slightly. "And just how did you know, Mrs. Pratt?" "From the way the poor things died." She added authority to the sadness. "Couldn't have been anything but a bad mushroom." The constable made a note. "A bad mushroom, meaning a poisonous one." Mrs. Pratt nodded. "And just where did you pick the mushrooms, Mrs. Pratt?" That did surprise and for a moment alarm her. She narrowed her eyes. "Who says I picked them?" "Did you not?" "Harriet says you often do." "So I do," she said. "Often. There's a spot at the edge of the woods where the meadow mushrooms are as fat as dumplings, but I didn't pick 'em that day." She settled herself more firmly in the chair. That day there was a deal more to be done than jaunting through the meadow picking mushrooms. They were company for luncheon, a great lot of it. 4 I made it, and the young miss, not to speak of the 2 upstairs, which didn't come down and wanted a tray. With respect, sir, if you don't believe me, come to the kitchen some day when there's company to luncheon and see how it's going on. I warned you, you'd find no time to go picking mushrooms. The constable looked at her. Where did the mushrooms come from then? It was the question she had been waiting for. "I bought 'em," she said firmly, "from a gypsy at the kitchen door." The constable appeared startled. "A gypsy?" "A lad," she allowed the sympathy to enter her voice. "His folks were cramped by the ditch. His father was a tinker, out looking for scissors and razors to grind. His mother was sick with fever, the poor thing, and his 3 little brothers within the village selling clothes, pegs, and cabbage nest." As Sarah spoke, the constable rapidly scratched in his notebook. She watched him, envying the speed of his writing. She could read, and read perfectly, having been taught by Miss Ellison, the now retired governess of Dedham National School. Miss Ellison had set her to read in the Royal Reader, where the young Sarah had been enthralled by such stories as The Skater Chased by Wolves and The Siege of Torquilstone from Ivanhoe, as well as descriptions of fairy islands constructed by an amazingly industrious mite called a coral, and reports of the vast frozen waste of the North-West Territory. Each year Her Majesty's gimlet-eyed inspector of schools came in his fine black frock coat with silk-faced lapels to put the young scholars to their annual examination, and Sarah would be placed in the front rank of the recitation to show off her reading ability. But when it came to shaping letters on paper, she was in a different sort of water. She was slow, and Mrs. Ellison's daily exercises in penmanship, lightly on the upstrokes, heavy on the down, seemed monotonously tedious. She envied those who could write down words as fast as they spilled out their brains. "Can you describe this gypsy boy?" the constable said. Sarah shrugged, thinking of the young man who stood before her. Brown hat pulled over his face, brown trousers a size or 2 beyond him, boots, dirty hands, about this high. She held a hand up to her nose to demonstrate height. Face brown as a chestnut. The constable eyed her. "Are you in the habit of buying foodstuffs from gypsies who call at the door, Mrs. Pratt?" His tone ambiguously implied both a doubt of her veracity and of her prudence. Sarah summoned dignity to her defence. "I'm in the habit, sir, of buying from windows when they got something I need. Old Willie Hogglestock comes Mondays with his cart full of fish and fruit, grapes, pears, apples. Tomatoes, too." She wrinkled her nose. "Nasty sour red things what'll make you sick. The gentry eats them with relish. Why, I don't know. Then there's Hawkins, the dairyman's helper, what brings milk, cream, and butter. Used to be a ship's carpenter, Hawkins did. Come on with the dairyman after his wife threatened to—" "I see," the constable said hurriedly. "When the gypsy boy offered the mushrooms, you looked through the basket quite carefully, did you?" "Ah!" This was the sticky part, and Sarah knew it. "To speak the God's truth, sir," she said, averting her eyes from the glance of the Queen, "I did not." "You did not?" "No, sir," she said remorsefully, "and I'll forever wonder in me heart whether 'twas my carelessness what caused the trouble." The constable frowned. "And how was that?" Sarah heaved a dramatic sigh. Well, sir, I thought to myself that boy might not be good at judging mushrooms, but I could see that he needed the money, mother's sick and father and tinker and all, so I paid him and paid a bit more than he asked for, part for pity in his predicament, part out of wanting the mushrooms. The elder Miss Ardley was right partial to him, and I thought make her a pudding, seeing as she was planning to give back the carpet. The constable looked confused, but did not interrupt. But as I was reaching for the basket to look through it to be sure no mushrooms were what they should be, there was a commotion. What sort of commotion? The lad looked round like over his shoulder, and there stood one of the guests looking at him. The boy took fright and bolted. And then what? Well, there I stood with a basket in my hand, thinking to sort it through like, but Harriet had made up the fire too hot and the soup boiled over. As I was tending that, I burned my thumb. She held it up to demonstrate the red welt. I dipped it in St. John's wort oil and bound it up and went back to the mushrooms, which were sitting on the table. But the spit gave way in the fire, and the joint dropped in the ash, and Mrs. Pratt, the constable said, are you telling me that you did not check the mushrooms? Yes, sir, Sarah said low. I aimed to do it before setting Harriet to chop, but the sweet stray got knocked over in. She dropped her head, her shoulders slumped under the weight of so many domestic tragedies. I made the cross for the pudding, and Harriet chopped the mushrooms, and that, sir, is how that deed was done. The constable spoke with care. So, there could have been a poisonous mushroom in the basket, and you would not have seen it. Yes, sir, Sarah said. No, sir. She frowned, trying to make out which the way the question went. Sir, she added, to make her answer clear, as I didn't see no poisonous mushroom. If I had, it would have never gotten in near the pudding. You can be sure of that. Did anyone else see the gypsy? She spoke truly. None of the servants, sir, but me. The guest, though, he got a glimpse of him. Not a good glimpse, though, she thought. He's the one what frightened him off. Do you know the name of the guest? Well, 'twas the Marstons who come for luncheon, and he was their guest, Sir Charles somebody or other, the same what pushed his way in while you was talking to Harriet. The constable's eyebrows went up. Sir Charles Sheridan, if that was the name, Sarah said cautiously. Her answers seemed to satisfy the constable. Only a few more questions, he said. Harriet cut up the mushrooms, and you prepared the pudding. In what sort of container? Why, in a pudding basin, of course, as Sarah said. It was steamed. Inside a pot with a cover on the stove? Sarah frowned. How else? For how long? An hour, most like, till it was done. Was anyone else in the kitchen during that hour? Sarah thought about it. Just me and Harriet, she frowned. And the young miss. She came in to make tea for her aunt and herself. The constable's mouth tightened at the corners. Did you go near the stove? Sarah's frown darkened. Couldn't say, sir, she said carefully. I had too much to do to be watching others. But the constable's eyes were still on her as he shut up his notebook and stood. I will confirm your report of the gypsy with Charles as quickly as I can. You will not object to being detained meanwhile. Sarah smiled comfortably. Oh, no, sir. I'd soon have the day to myself, especially seeing as it was wash day. She stood. You don't suppose, that Pocket would bring the carriage when it's time for me to go back to Bishop's Keep? The constable's lips twitched. I can't say, but I will inquire. Thank you, sir, Sarah said. She looked up at the Queen's photograph and dropped a deep curtsy, pleasantly conscious that she had met her obligation to the Crown while still protecting the innocence of one whose motives she pitied rather than hated. The Queen gave her a benevolent smile.